Move your seat. The voice was sharp, cutting through the hum of the airplane like a blade. John Davis, a black single dad with a quiet demeanor, looked up in surprise. The pilot, a man dressed in crisp white, stood at the front, glaring at him with an air of authority. John's heart skipped a beat as the request hit him, but he didn't immediately respond. He hadn't expected to be treated like this. He was just trying to get to his daughter, who had been waiting for him back at home. A single father, doing his best. The world seemed to be in a constant rush, but he was used to it, used to being overlooked. He simply nodded, stood, and grabbed his small bag from the overhead compartment, making his way toward the aisle. The pilot didn't see it coming. John wasn't the man he thought he was. As he walked down the aisle, passengers gave him curious glances, some even whispering. The pilot had no idea that the man he was treating so harshly was the very person who owned the plane they were flying on. John could feel the weight of his calmness, the control he kept tight within himself. He had worked hard for everything he had, fought battles that nobody saw. People looked at him and saw just a simple man, just another face in the crowd. He wasn't one to show off, to parade his wealth. But he knew this moment would come. He had always known that one day, the world would make assumptions about him that weren't true, and that day had arrived. As he reached the front of the plane, John turned slowly to face the pilot, his expression neutral, but his eyes sharp. "You know who owns this plane?" he asked, his voice calm, but carrying weight. The pilot blinked in confusion, clearly caught off guard by the question. What do you mean?" he stammered. John smiled lightly. "I own this plane," he said, his voice steady. The pilot's face went pale. 1,000 thoughts rushed through his head, trying to make sense of the situation. The realization dawned on him slowly, but by then, it was too late. John didn't wait for an apology. He simply walked past the stunned pilot, back to his seat. The whispers around him grew louder, but he didn't mind. They didn't know his story. They didn't know that he had worked for every penny, fought for his place in this world. And he certainly didn't need anyone to remind him of his worth. As the plane began its descent, John gazed out the window, lost in thought. This was just another chapter in his life, another reminder that sometimes the world will underestimate you. But in the end, it was never about what they thought of you. It was about who you truly were. John sat back in his seat, the plane humming as it cruised at 30,000 feet. The whispers from the other passengers had died down, but the tension in the air was palpable. He could feel the stares, the curiosity, and the unease hanging around him like a thick fog. People weren't sure what to think. Was he just another ordinary passenger, or was there something more to him? His phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was a text from his daughter, Emma. "Daddy, when are you coming home? I miss you." His heart softened as he read the message. Emma, just 8 years old, had always been the center of his world. Everything he did, every sacrifice he made, was for her. The struggles, the sleepless nights, the long hours at work, it was all worth it to see her smile. He missed her too, more than he could put into words. As the plane continued its journey, John leaned back in his seat, eyes closed, letting the quiet hum of the engines soothe him. He wasn't the type to seek attention, to flaunt his wealth. He had learned early on that the less people knew, the better. But life had a way of surprising him. He never imagined that a simple flight would bring him face to face with an unexpected moment of power reversal. The pilot's request to move seats had been rude, sure, but it had been more than that. It had been a reminder of how easy it was for people to underestimate others based on nothing more than their appearance. John wasn't offended by the pilot's actions, not really. He was used to it. But it was moments like this that made him realize just how far he had come. Growing up in a rough neighborhood, John had learned to keep his head down and stay out of trouble. He had worked hard to get out, to build a life for himself and Emma. His success wasn't a fluke. It was the result of years of dedication, perseverance, and the unwavering belief that he could change his circumstances. As the plane descended, John looked out the window, the city below becoming clearer with each passing moment. He could see the outline of the tall buildings, the sprawling streets, and the familiar landmarks that had been part of his life for so long. He had made it. He had built something from nothing, and he wasn't about to let anyone take that away from him. When the plane finally landed, the passengers began to gather their things, eager to get off the flight. John stood up, taking his bag from the overhead compartment. As he walked down the aisle, he passed the pilot, who was still standing by the cockpit, looking at him with a mix of awe and embarrassment. John didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The pilot had learned his lesson, and that was enough. As he stepped off the plane and into the airport terminal, John felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. It wasn't about the money, the power, or the recognition. It was about knowing that he had earned everything he had through his own efforts, and that no one could ever take that away from him. As John walked through the bustling terminal, the weight of the earlier events seemed to slowly fade. The noise of the airport, the chatter of passengers, the beeping of announcements all blended into the background as he made his way toward the baggage claim. His mind was still partly on the flight, on the pilot's reaction, but more importantly, on Emma. His little girl had been waiting for him. Her bright smile and innocent questions always brought him back to what truly mattered. He had spent so many years building his career, climbing ladders, but at the end of the day, it was always Emma who gave him a reason to keep going. His phone buzzed again, snapping him out of his thoughts. He pulled it from his pocket, seeing her name pop up on the screen. Asterisk, Daddy, did you land safely? I can't wait to see you. Asterisk, his heart swelled as he typed a quick reply, letting her know he would be home soon. As he walked, a small part of him couldn't help but smile at the irony of it all. Life had a funny way of showing you who you really were, not by what you owned, but by the people around you and the way you treated them. John had built his wealth, yes, but he had always stayed grounded. He knew that the real treasures in life weren't the material things that people often chased after. No, the real treasures were the moments, the relationships, the genuine connections you made along the way. A few minutes later, he reached the baggage claim area. His bag had already been delivered, and he quickly grabbed it, eager to head out and get back to his daughter. As he turned to leave, he caught sight of a familiar face, one of the flight attendants from his earlier flight. She was standing near the entrance, looking around. When she saw him, her eyes widened in surprise. He gave her a nod, not wanting to dwell on the past, but also not wanting to ignore her. She hesitated for a moment, then walked over to him. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice a little shaky. "I just wanted to apologize for what happened earlier. The pilot, he didn't know who you were, and he didn't mean to make you uncomfortable." John smiled gently, shaking his head. "It's okay," he said. "It's not about him. It's about how we all treat each other. You don't need to apologize." The flight attendant looked relieved, a small smile forming on her lips. "Thank you," she said. "I've heard a lot about you. I didn't realize. I just wanted to say that you're not what I expected." In a good way. John's eyes softened. "People often don't see what's beneath the surface," he said, his tone calm, but with a certain understanding. The flight attendant nodded, her eyes still wide with admiration. "You really changed my perspective," she said quietly. "Thank you for being kind." John nodded, giving her a smile before turning and walking away. As he headed toward the exit, he thought about the way the world worked. Sometimes, it took just one moment to change someone's perception. The pilot had underestimated him, but it didn't matter. What mattered was how John had handled the situation. With dignity, with kindness, and with the knowledge that he didn't need to prove himself to anyone. He had already done the hard work. He had already earned his place. And now, it was time to go home. As he walked outside into the cool air, he felt the weight of the day lift from his shoulders. The journey wasn't over, but he had made it this far. And with every step he took toward his daughter, he knew that the rest of the world could keep underestimating him. It was their loss. John stepped out of the terminal, the cool evening air brushing against his face. His heart, still full from the day's events, calmed with each step he took toward the parking lot. As he approached his car, he thought about how much things had changed over the years. He had come so far from where he started. It wasn't just the money, the house, or the status, though all of that had come with hard work. It was the peace of knowing he had earned his place in this world. The small, quiet victories that no one saw were the ones that meant the most. As he reached his car, he felt a sense of pride. Pride not just in his material success, but in the way he had handled everything in his life. He had fought for every inch, not just in business, but in his personal life. Raising Emma on his own had been the toughest challenge, but it was the one he was most proud of. The joy of hearing her laugh, watching her grow, those moments were worth more than anything else. He got into the car, starting the engine and pulling out of the parking lot. His phone buzzed again, and he glanced at the screen. Another text from Emma. Asterisk, can't wait for you to get home. I made you a surprise. Asterisk John smiled as he drove, his mind already on the simple joys of being home with his daughter. The drive home felt shorter than usual, maybe because his mind was so occupied with thoughts of her. He couldn't wait to see her, to hear about her day, to catch up on everything that had happened while he was away. As he pulled into the driveway, he saw Emma standing by the door, a big grin on her face. She had a piece of paper in her hand, and her eyes sparkled with excitement. "Daddy, look," she exclaimed as she ran up to him. He stepped out of the car, smiling warmly as she handed him the paper. It was a drawing of the two of them, standing in front of a big house with a yard full of flowers. It wasn't the most polished drawing, but it was perfect in its simplicity. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," he said, crouching down to hug her tightly. "You made this for me?" Emma nodded eagerly. "It's us, Daddy. I want to live here forever, with you." John felt a lump form in his throat as he hugged her even tighter. This was everything he had worked for. Not the wealth, not the recognition, but this moment right here, this feeling of being loved and needed. "We will, baby," he whispered. "We'll always be together." As they walked into the house, John knew that no matter what challenges the world threw at him, as long as he had Emma, he had everything he needed. He had already won. The next morning, John woke up to the soft sound of Emma humming in the kitchen. It was a familiar, comforting sound, the sound of his daughter making her own breakfast, a sign that she was growing up so fast. He smiled to himself, stretching as he got out of bed and walked toward the kitchen. As he entered, he saw Emma standing on a stool, trying her best to make pancakes. There was flour everywhere, and the kitchen smelled like syrup, but it was the most beautiful sight in the world to him. "Morning, sweetheart," John said, leaning against the doorframe. Emma turned around, her face lighting up as she saw him. "Morning, Daddy. I made pancakes. They're not perfect, but I tried." John chuckled softly, walking over to her and kissing the top of her head. "They'll be perfect because you made them," he said, his voice full of warmth. Emma beamed at the compliment, her small hands stirring the batter with intense concentration. John poured himself a cup of coffee, sitting down at the kitchen table and watching her with a sense of pride. There was no greater joy in his life than being a father to Emma. The world outside could be full of challenges, full of moments where people tried to underestimate him. But at the end of the day, it was moments like this, simple, pure, and full of love, that made everything worth it. As they sat down to eat breakfast together, John's mind wandered to the events of the past week. He thought about the pilot, about how he had been treated with such condescension, but he also thought about how he had handled it, how he had risen above it. He realized that it wasn't about the pilot or the power dynamics in that moment. It was about how he carried himself, how he stayed true to who he was, even when others tried to box him in. It was about showing kindness, dignity, and strength, even when the world expected him to react with anger or frustration. That was the kind of man he wanted Emma to see him as, a man who didn't let the opinions of others define him, a man who treated everyone with respect, no matter their station in life. As they finished breakfast, John looked at Emma, her innocent eyes full of hope and trust. He knew that he had to set an example for her, to show her that the world wasn't always fair, but that didn't mean you couldn't rise above it. He stood up, walking over to where Emma was still sitting at the table. "You know, kiddo," he said softly, "it doesn't matter what anyone else thinks. What matters is that we know who we are, and we're always true to ourselves." Emma looked up at him with a thoughtful expression. "I know, Daddy. You always teach me that." John smiled and ruffled her hair. "And I always will." As the day went on, John took Emma to the park, just like he did every Saturday. It was their time to spend together, to talk, to laugh, and to enjoy each other's company. He realized that, in the end, all the wealth, the success, and the achievements in the world didn't matter if he didn't have moments like these. With Emma by his side, he felt like he had everything he needed. The world could keep trying to put him in a box, but he was going to keep living life on his own terms, with dignity, kindness, and love as his guide. The following week, as John and Emma sat down for their usual Saturday breakfast, he couldn't help but reflect on everything that had happened in the past few days. Life had a way of presenting challenges, but he had learned to navigate them with patience, dignity, and understanding. It was never about proving something to others. It was about remaining true to himself. As he watched Emma pour syrup over her pancakes, her face lighting up with excitement. He felt a deep sense of gratitude. She was growing so quickly, and with every passing day, she reminded him of why he had worked so hard. The world was full of people who tried to define you by your appearance, by your past, or by your status. But John had learned that what truly mattered was who you were when no one was looking. He had fought hard for everything he had, but none of it mattered if he couldn't be the kind of father Emma needed. After breakfast, they spent the rest of the day at the park, enjoying the fresh air and each other's company. It was simple, but it was everything. As they walked along the path, Emma's small hand tightly clutching his, John noticed the way people looked at them. There were moments when he saw the curiosity in their eyes, the silent judgment, but he didn't let it bother him. It had always been that way. People made assumptions about him, about his life, about his success. But none of that defined him. He knew who he was. He knew what he had worked for, and he didn't need anyone else's validation. "Daddy, look," Emma exclaimed, pointing to a group of children playing by the swings. John smiled, following her gaze. "Go ahead, sweetie," he said, nudging her toward the other kids. "Have fun. I'll be here." Emma ran off with a burst of energy, joining the other children in their game. John watched her, his heart swelling with pride. She was happy. She was healthy. And for the first time in a long while, he felt a deep sense of peace. As the afternoon wore on, John sat on a nearby bench, taking in the sounds of the park, the laughter of children, the distant hum of conversations, the rustle of leaves in the breeze. It was the kind of peaceful moment he had always dreamed of, a moment where nothing else mattered. It was in these small, quiet moments that John found his true wealth. Not in the material things, not in the status or the power, but in the love and happiness he shared with Emma. That was the real victory. When the sun began to set, painting the sky with hues of orange and pink, Emma ran back to him, her face flushed from playing. "Daddy, I'm tired," she said, holding out her hand. "Let's go home." John stood up, taking her hand in his, and together they walked toward the car. As they drove home, the quiet hum of the engine was the only sound between them. John glanced at Emma in the rearview mirror, watching her fall asleep in the back seat, her small body curled up against the seat. He couldn't help but smile. This was everything. This was what it was all about. As they pulled into the driveway, John felt a deep sense of gratitude. He had worked hard, faced challenges, and overcome obstacles. But none of that compared to this moment of peace, of family, of love. And as he carried Emma inside, gently placing her into bed, he whispered, "I'll always be here, sweetheart. Always." The following week, as John sat in his home office, his laptop open in front of him, he found himself reflecting on the journey that had led him here. The quiet, ordinary moments with Emma had become his refuge, his reminder of why he had worked so tirelessly to build the life they shared. The phone buzzed on his desk, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was a text from an old colleague, someone he hadn't heard from in months. Asterisk, "Hey John, long time. Would love to catch up soon. Let me know when you're free." Asterisk, he thought about it for a moment. His mind was consumed with work, but he realized that he hadn't connected with anyone outside of his immediate circle in a long time. The idea of rekindling old friendships, of reaching out to the people who had been part of his past, felt like a step forward. He typed a quick reply, agreeing to meet up the following weekend. As the day went on, John's thoughts drifted back to the pilot, the man who had underestimated him. It wasn't about the confrontation on the plane. It was about how people so often made assumptions about others based on appearances. He had spent his life breaking through barriers, defying expectations, and building a future that wasn't dictated by anyone else's judgment. And while the world could be full of prejudices, John knew that true strength lay in how you responded to those challenges. As the week passed, John continued his work, meeting clients, making decisions, and managing his business with the same quiet determination he had always had. But at night, when he was home with Emma, he allowed himself to fully be present. They spent evenings reading together, playing games, and talking about everything and nothing at all. Those moments with Emma were the foundation of his success, the driving force behind everything he did. One evening, as they were sitting on the couch watching a movie, Emma looked up at him, her small face serious. "Daddy," she said, "why do people sometimes treat us differently?" John paused, his heart aching. He knew she had been exposed to the subtle ways the world could be unkind, even at her young age. People make judgments based on things they don't understand, he replied, his voice steady. But we don't have to let those judgments define who we are. We know who we are, and that's all that matters. Emma nodded, her eyes wide as she processed his words. I know, Daddy. I just want people to know you're a good person. John smiled, pulling her close. And they will, sweetheart. They will. As the days turned into weeks, John found that his perspective had shifted. The pilot, the moments of judgment, the assumptions others made, none of it mattered anymore. What mattered was the life he had built with Emma, the family they had become. Everything else was secondary. One afternoon, as he sat at his desk reviewing some financial reports, his phone buzzed again. This time it was a call. It was from an old friend, someone he hadn't spoken to in years. John, it's been too long, his friend said, his voice full of warmth. I just wanted to check in and see how you're doing. Life's been crazy, huh? John laughed softly, feeling the weight of the years and the distance between them. Yeah, it really has, he replied. But I'm good. Things are good. Just focusing on the important stuff now. His friend laughed, too. That's the way to do it. I'm glad to hear it. As they caught up, John realized that while success was still a part of his life, it no longer defined him. What mattered most was the love he shared with Emma, the quiet moments, the lessons he was teaching her, and the legacy he would leave. And as the conversation ended, John felt a sense of peace wash over him. He didn't need to prove anything to anyone. He had already won the most important battle, the battle for his own happiness, his own sense of worth. And with that, he smiled, knowing that the journey was just beginning. As the days passed, John found himself in a peaceful rhythm. Work was busy as usual, but it didn't feel like a burden anymore. He had learned to balance his responsibilities with the simple joys of life. He had Emma, his foundation, and the love they shared was enough to keep him grounded. The small victories, like watching her grow, seeing her smile, and knowing he was providing a stable and loving home, were worth more than anything money could buy. One evening, as John sat in his living room with Emma, reading her favorite bedtime story, he thought about the lessons he had learned over the years. He thought about the assumptions people made about him, the way they had judged him based on his appearance, his background, and his humble demeanor. But through it all, he had stayed true to who he was, never letting the opinions of others define him. Daddy, Emma said, her voice soft as she snuggled into his side. I like it when we read together. John smiled, kissing the top of her head. I like it too, sweetie. You know, these moments with you mean everything to me. Emma looked up at him, her eyes wide with curiosity. Do you ever get tired, Daddy? She asked. John paused, thinking for a moment. Sometimes, sweetie, but when I see you happy, when I see you smile, it makes everything worth it. You give me strength, Emma. She smiled, her face lighting up with joy. I'm glad I make you happy, Daddy, she said, her small hand reaching up to hold his. I want you to be happy forever. John's heart swelled with emotion. It was moments like this, simple and pure, that reminded him of what really mattered. It wasn't the wealth, the status, or the recognition. It was the love they shared, the bond they had, and the quiet happiness that filled their home. After reading the story, John tucked Emma into bed, kissing her forehead as she drifted off to sleep. As he quietly closed the door behind him, he stood for a moment, looking at the room. He had created this life from scratch. Every sacrifice, every challenge he had faced, had led him to this point. And as he stood there, a quiet smile on his face, he realized that it had all been worth it. The world might have underestimated him, judged him based on his appearance or his background, but John knew something they didn't. He knew that true wealth wasn't measured in money or status. It was measured in moments like this. It was in the love he shared with Emma, in the quiet strength that came from knowing he was doing his best. As he walked back to his own room, he thought about the future. He didn't know what challenges lay ahead, but he was ready to face them, knowing that as long as he had Emma by his side, he could overcome anything. He had already won the most important victory of all, and that victory wasn't about power or prestige. It was about love, about family, and about being true to who he was. As John settled into bed, he closed his eyes, letting the peace of the night wash over him. Tomorrow would come with its own challenges, but for tonight, he was content. He had everything he needed right here, in this moment, with Emma, and that was enough. As the days turned into weeks, John felt the weight of the world shifting around him. There were moments of challenge, moments when the outside world seemed to question his worth or misunderstand his intentions. But through it all, he found strength in the quiet moments he shared with Emma. She had become his anchor, the steady pulse that kept him grounded through the storms of life. It was a Saturday morning, just like so many others, when John found himself sitting on the porch, watching Emma play in the yard. She was running around, chasing after the dog, her laughter ringing through the air like music. For a brief moment, John closed his eyes and simply listened, letting the sound wash over him. This was the life he had worked so hard for. Not the big house, not the expensive car, but this peace, this love, this connection with the one person who mattered most to him. Emma's laughter slowly faded as she came over to him, holding out a small flower she had picked from the garden. "Look, Daddy, I made this for you," she said, her eyes sparkling with excitement. John smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "Thank you, sweetheart," he said, taking the flower and holding it gently. "It's beautiful just like you." Emma beamed, her face lighting up with joy. They sat together on the porch, watching the sun slowly climb higher in the sky. John realized that no amount of money, no level of success, could ever replace these moments. The love he shared with Emma was priceless. As the days passed, John began to reflect more on his journey. He thought about the pilot, about how he had been judged based on his appearance, how people had assumed he was just another average man. But John had learned long ago that appearances were deceiving. It wasn't the outward success that defined him. It was the inner strength, the resilience, and the love that he carried with him every day. His life wasn't perfect, but it was his. He had earned every bit of it, and he was proud of the man he had become. One afternoon, as John was sitting at his desk, working on a project, his phone buzzed with a message from an old business associate. The message read, "John, I know it's been a while, but I've been thinking about the way we used to work together. I'd love to catch up and talk about some opportunities." John smiled to himself, feeling a mix of excitement and caution. He had worked hard to build his reputation, but he had also learned that not everything was worth pursuing. He didn't need to prove himself to anyone anymore. But still, the thought of reconnecting, of seeing what had changed in the business world since he had shifted his focus to his family, was intriguing. He quickly typed a reply, agreeing to meet the following week. The message sent, John leaned back in his chair and thought about the future. He had no illusions about what lay ahead. There would be challenges, there would be setbacks, but one thing was certain: he would face them head on, just as he always had. He had learned that it wasn't about the destination. It was about the journey. It was about the people you met along the way, the lessons you learned, and the love you gave and received. That was the true measure of success. As the evening approached, John stood up from his desk and walked to the window, looking out over the quiet street. The world was still out there, moving at its own pace, full of uncertainty and opportunity. But in that moment, John knew that whatever came next, he was ready for it. With Emma by his side, with the love and strength they shared, there was nothing he couldn't face. He had everything he needed, right here, right now.